The beep of a heart monitor is a kind of clock, but it doesn't measure hours or minutes. It measures the precarious, pulsing distance between a life lived and a life ending. I've built my entire adult life listening to that sound, learning to interpret its frantic races and its slow, tired declines. I learned to see the human body as a magnificent, complex, and terribly fragile machine. My hands became tools for repair, my mind a database of protocols and probabilities. I was Dr. Eris Thorne, a cardiologist, and I believed that with enough knowledge, enough skill, enough sheer will, I could hold back the tide. I never understood that some tides aren't meant to be held back. They are meant to wash over you, to scour you clean, to reshape the very shoreline of your soul. The night Arthur Pembroke died, the tide finally broke through my defenses. And the words he left behind, whispered on a breath that was his very last, didn't just change my life, they revealed a connection so profound it felt as if the universe itself had been telling a story for 50 years, and I was only now hearing the final, breathtaking chapter. My life before Arthur was a study in structure. It had to be. The hospital where I work, St. Jude's Memorial, is a city within a city, a world of its own with its own laws, its own language, its own relentless rhythm. My days began before sunrise, with the first week light filtering through the windows of the doctor's lounge, painting the linoleum floors in shades of pale gray. The first sip of bitter, stale coffee was a sacrament. The weight of the white coat on my shoulders was the weight of my purpose. I would walk the halls, my footsteps echoing in the quiet dawn, a general surveying her kingdom before the day's battles began. The charts in the rack outside each room were like sealed orders, each one a story of a body in rebellion. A clogged artery here, a faltering valve there, a muscle grown tired and weak. These were problems I understood. They had diagrams. They had treatment plans. They were solvable. I first met Arthur Pembroke on a Tuesday. I remember because Tuesdays were always packed with clinic appointments, a relentless parade of human worry and hope. His name was on my list, a new referral for congestive heart failure. When I walked into the exam room, he was sitting perfectly still on the edge of the table, his hands resting on his knees. Most new patients are nervous, fidgeting with their gowns, their eyes darting around the room. But Arthur was calm. Still. He had a quiet dignity about him that immediately filled the small, sterile space. He was in his late 70s, with a full head of silver-white hair and eyes the color of a calm sea. He looked at me not with the frantic hope I often saw, but with a gentle, weary curiosity. "Mr. Pembroke, I'm Dr. Thorne," I said, offering my hand. His handshake was firm, but his skin was papery and cool. "Arthur, please." "It's a pleasure to meet you, Doctor." We went through the usual history. His shortness of breath, the swelling in his ankles, the fatigue that had become his constant companion. He answered my questions with a quiet precision, but he offered nothing more. When I asked about family, about who I could call in case of an emergency, he simply shook his head. "There's no one," he said, and his voice was so final, so utterly devoid of self-pity, that it struck me as more sad than if he had wept. I ordered the standard tests, an echocardiogram, blood work, a stress test he couldn't complete. The results were clear. His heart, a hard-working pump for nearly 8 decades, was wearing out. The left ventricle, the main pumping chamber, was enlarged and sluggish. It was a common story. We could manage it, we could slow the progression, but we couldn't stop it. It was a slow, inevitable decline. He was admitted to the hospital a few weeks later for a tune-up, diuretics to reduce the fluid in his lungs, medications to ease the strain on his heart. It was during this first admission that I began to see the man beyond the patient. While other rooms were filled with the chatter of visitors and the blare of daytime television, Arthur's room was a sanctuary of silence. He was always reading. Not magazines, but thick, dense volumes of history and biography. I saw Marcus Aurelius's Meditations on his bedside table once, and a collection of Robert Frost's poetry another time. One afternoon, after I'd finished my rounds, I found myself pausing at his doorway. He was looking out the window, watching the rain, his book closed in his lap. "Everything all right, Arthur?" I asked. He turned and gave me a small, sad smile. Just thinking, doctor. It's a good day for thinking. About anything in particular? About choices, he said, his gaze drifting back to the rain. The paths we take, and the ones we leave behind. Do you ever wonder about the people you might have been, if you'd made one different choice? The question was so philosophical, so personal, it felt out of place in the clinical setting of the hospital. I was used to questions about medication side effects and dietary restrictions. I leaned against the doorframe, my pager momentarily forgotten on my hip. I think we all do, sometimes. It's human nature. It's a heavy thing to carry, he said, almost to himself. The weight of all those other lives you could have lived. That was the first crack. The first hint that this quiet, lonely man carried a universe of regret inside his failing heart. I started to make a point of stopping by his room, even when I didn't have a medical reason. I'd ask him about his book. He'd ask me about my day. It was a small, quiet connection, but in the high-stakes, high-stress environment of my job, it became an anchor of normalcy. He never complained. He never demanded. He was just present. A steady, calm presence in the storm of my professional life. That storm was something I had cultivated. From a young age, I was drawn to order, to answers. I think it was a reaction to my home life. My mother, Elara, is a force of nature. An artist. Her world was one of vibrant chaos, of emotion splashed across a canvas, of deadlines missed and bills forgotten in the passionate pursuit of a perfect line or a daring color. Our house was never quiet, never still. It was filled with the smell of oil paint and turpentine, with half-finished sculptures and canvases leaning against every wall. My mother lived her life in a state of glorious, tumultuous feeling. She laughed louder, cried harder, and loved more fiercely than anyone I've ever known. And I, her only daughter, was a mystery to her. Where she saw a world of color and emotion, I saw a world of structure and function. I loved biology. I loved the elegant logic of the Krebs cycle, the precise engineering of the human skeleton, the clear cause and effect of disease pathology. When I told her I wanted to be a doctor, she looked at me as if I'd announced I was moving to the moon. A doctor, she'd said, wiping a smear of cerulean blue from her cheek. But it's so cold, Eris. All that sickness. All those rules. It's not cold, it's necessary, I'd retorted, a teenager full of defensive certainty. I'll be helping people. You can help people by painting them a beautiful picture that makes them forget their troubles for a while, she'd said, only half joking. That was the fundamental rift between us. She believed in healing the soul through beauty and emotion. I believed in healing the body through science and reason. We were two different species speaking two different languages. As I moved through college and medical school, the rift widened into a chasm. I was buried in textbooks, in labs, in the grueling hours of residency. I missed family holidays. I missed her birthday parties. I missed the opening of her first major gallery show because I was in the middle of a 36-hour shift. Each missed event was another brick in a wall I was building between us. I told myself it was the necessary price of my calling. She saw it as a personal rejection. Our weekly Sunday dinners were a torturous ritual. I would drive to her house, still carrying the hospital with me, the tension in my shoulders, the quick, clipped way I spoke, the mental checklist of tasks still waiting for me. She would greet me at the door, her hand stained with paint, her embrace always a little too tight, a little too long, as if she could squeeze me back into the daughter she remembered. The table would be set with her beautiful, hand-thrown pottery, the food a lavish, loving production. But the air would be thick with all the things we couldn't say. You look tired, Eris, she'd say, passing me a bowl of salad. Are you getting any sleep? Enough, I'd reply, my standard, deflective answer. I saw a program about heart surgery, she'd continue, her voice laced with a kind of horrified fascination. All that blood and machinery. How can you stand it? Doesn't it haunt you? It's not about standing it, Mother. It's about fixing what's broken. You don't think about the blood when you're trying to save a life. But the life, Eris, she'd exclaim, her voice rising. The person. They're not just a broken pump. They have a history, a family, they have a soul. Don't you ever think about that? Of course I do, I'd say, my voice growing colder, a defensive tactic I had mastered. But in the moment, I have to focus on the pump. If the pump stops, nothing else matters. The conversation would spiral down from there, into a familiar stalemate. She would accuse me of becoming cold and unfeeling. I would accuse her of not understanding the weight of my responsibility. We were both right, and we were both wrong. The truth was, I had to build a wall to survive. The emotional chaos of my childhood had been overwhelming, and the controlled chaos of the hospital was my escape. It was a chaos I could manage. It had rules. And Arthur Pembroke, in his quiet, gentle way, began to chip away at that wall. During his second prolonged admission, I started doing small things for him. He mentioned he missed a particular brand of peppermint tea. The next day, I brought him a box from the store. His gratitude was so profound it was almost embarrassing. You didn't have to do that, Dr. Thorne, he'd said, his eyes shining. You're too kind. In return, he began to offer me things, too. Not physical things, but pieces of wisdom, fragments of his philosophy. He loaned me a book of Mary Oliver's poetry. For when the science gets too heavy, he'd said. Poetry is the art of listening to the heart's quietest whispers. I took it home and left it on my nightstand for weeks, a silent reproach to my clinical world. But one night, after I'd lost a patient, a young man, a father of two, to a sudden, massive coronary, I picked it up. I opened it at random and read, "What is it you plan to do with your one wild and precious life?" I sat on my cold, sterile apartment floor and wept for an hour. Arthur had seen a crack in my armor, and he had gently, kindly, widened it. The most significant conversation we ever had was on a day of relentless, pouring rain. The sky was the color of lead, and the windows of his room were sheets of moving water. I came in to find him not reading, just staring out at the deluge, his expression unreadable. You're very quiet today, Arthur, I said, taking the chair beside his bed. He was silent for so long I thought he hadn't heard me. Then, he spoke, his voice low and distant. I had a daughter, once. The statement hung in the air between us, simple and devastating. I said nothing, just waited. Her name was Alara. A name I had never heard before, but one that sounded like music. She was 5 years old. She had her mother's eyes. Dark, deep, full of intelligence and light. He took a shaky breath. I wasn't much older than you are now. And I was broken. Not in a way you could see. Not a broken bone or a sick heart. I was broken in my spirit. I was terrified of failing them, of not being enough. The weight of it, it felt like it was crushing me. He told me then the story that would later redefine my own. He told me about waking up before dawn, the house silent, the fear a cold knot in his stomach. He told me about packing a single bag, about walking on his toes so the floorboards wouldn't creak. He told me about standing in the doorway of his daughter's room, watching her sleep, her small chest rising and falling, a stuffed rabbit tucked under her arm. He told me about the kiss he placed on her forehead, so light it barely touched her skin. And he told me about walking out the door, down the street, and out of their lives forever. It was the act of a coward, he whispered, the rain drumming a funeral march on the glass. The most cowardly thing a man can do. I told myself they were better off without me. That I was doing them a favor. But it was a lie. I was saving myself from the terrifying prospect of my own inadequacy. And that one choice, that single, terrible act of fear, it became the foundation of my entire life. Every path I walked after that was the wrong path, because it was a path that led away from them. I sat there, utterly still, my own breath caught in my throat. The confession was so raw, so full of a pain that had been festering for over 50 years, that it felt sacred. I didn't offer platitudes. I didn't tell him it was okay. Because it wasn't. I just listened. And in his story, I heard a distorted echo of my own. Was I not also walking a path that led away from my mother? Was I not also hiding behind my competence, using my career as a justification for my emotional distance? The parallels were too painful to examine closely. Did you ever try to find her? I asked softly. He shook his head, a tear tracing a path through the wrinkles on his cheek. For years, I was too ashamed. Then, I was afraid of what I would find. That she was dead. Or that she was happy, and I would just be a ghost from a past she'd rather forget. The not knowing was a punishment, but it was one I felt I deserved. He looked at me then, and his eyes held a strange, piercing intensity. Guilt like that, Eris, it doesn't just live in your mind. It sinks into your bones. It becomes a part of your very cells. I think it's the real disease here. I think it's what's killing me. I left his room that day feeling like I'd been given a great and terrible gift. I carried his story with me for weeks, turning it over in my mind, feeling its weight. It made him more human to me, and in doing so, it made me feel more human, too. The call about his final crisis came in the deep, silent hours of the night. The kind of night where the world feels asleep and the hospital becomes a lonely ship on a dark sea. My pager screamed to life, shattering the silence of my on-call room. Code Blue, room 418. Pembroke. My body was moving before my mind could fully engage. The sprint down the corridor felt endless, the fluorescent lights strobing overhead. I burst into his room. It was already a scene of controlled pandemonium. The crash cart was open, its drawers gaping, spilling out syringes and packets and electrodes. A nurse was on a step stool, performing chest compressions, her body rocking with the brutal, rhythmic force of the act. 1, 2, 3, 4. The sound of his ribs cracking under the pressure was a sickening, muffled popping. The monitor showed a frantic, disorganized squiggle, ventricular fibrillation. His heart wasn't beating, it was quivering, a bag of worms in his chest. Eris. Sarah, my head nurse, yelled as I entered. He's in V-fib. Unresponsive. Okay, let's move. I barked, my voice the voice of Commander Thorne. The automaton had taken over. Stop compressions. Check the rhythm. The compression stopped. The squiggling line continued. Confirmed V-fib. Charge to 200. Clear. I looked around, making sure no one was touching the bed. Clear. I pressed the buttons. His body jolted violently on the bed. The line on the monitor flatlined for a heart-stopping second, then the chaotic squiggle returned. No change. Resume compressions. Epinephrine, 1 milligram, push. Now. I was shouting, my mind a whirlwind of drug dosages and algorithms. We were following a script, a desperate playbook for cheating death. We shocked him again. And again. We pumped him full of amiodarone, of lidocaine. We inserted a breathing tube. I placed a central line, my hands impossibly steady as I guided the needle into his jugular vein, the dark blood flashing back into the syringe, a confirmation of placement. I was a master of my craft, using every tool, every trick I had. But as the minutes ticked by, a cold dread began to seep into my veins. I looked at his face. Amidst the tangle of tubes and tape, his expression was serene. There was no fight left in him. He had been ready. My eyes met Sarah's. She had been with me through 100 of these codes. Her face was a mask of professional focus, but her eyes told me everything. They were sad. Resigned. She gave a tiny, almost imperceptible shake of her head. The automaton wanted to push for another round, another drug. But the woman, the one who had shared tea and poetry with this man, knew it was over. We were no longer trying to save a life, we were profaning a death. We were breaking the vessel that had already released its spirit. I took a deep, shuddering breath, the air tasting of sweat and antiseptic and despair. "Stop," I said, my voice suddenly quiet. "Stop compressions." The room went still. The nurse on the step stool stopped, her shoulders slumping. The only sound was the relentless, single-toned whine of the flatline. A sound of absolute, final silence. I looked at the clock on the wall, its digital numbers burning into my soul. Time of death. 2:14 a.m. The team began the slow, disassembling ritual. They turned off the shrieking monitors, their screens going dark, silent. They carefully removed the breathing tube, the 4 lines. They gathered the used syringes, the packaging, the detritus of our failed war. They moved with a quiet, respectful efficiency, but they were already moving on, their minds shifting to the next task, the next patient. The river of the hospital was flowing again, already smoothing over the stone that had been Arthur Pembroke. I stood there, alone in the sudden, deafening silence, as they filed out. The protocol was to follow them, to write the death note, to make the calls. But my feet were rooted to the spot. The professional dam I had built over a decade, the fortress that held back a whole ocean of grief, finally, catastrophically, shattered. It wasn't just for Arthur. It was for the young mother I'd lost to a postpartum cardiomyopathy, for the teenage boy with the undiagnosed genetic defect, for every life that had slipped through my fingers. It was for all the Sunday dinners I'd missed, for the disappointed look in my mother's eyes, for the little girl who loved the smell of paint and who I had locked away in the name of strength. A sob, raw and ugly, ripped from my throat. I stumbled to the side of his bed. His hand was still warm. I took it in mine, this hand that had held books of poetry, that had written in a journal, that had once, a lifetime ago, held his little girl's hand. "I'm so sorry, Arthur," I wept, the words barely intelligible. "I'm so sorry I couldn't fix you. I failed you." And then, it happened. His fingers twitched in mine. I gasped, pulling back, thinking it was a residual nerve impulse, a final, random firing of a dying neuron. But then his lips parted. A faint breath, a wisp of air that smelled of peppermint and something else, something metallic and final, passed between them. I leaned in, my ear close to his mouth, my own tears falling onto the starched white sheet. I was a scientist, a woman of evidence. This was a physiological phenomenon, a final exhalation. But then I heard it. The voice was not the weak, raspy whisper of the last few months. It was clearer, stronger, imbued with a desperate, final clarity. It was the voice of the young, terrified father from his story. "Elara," he breathed. The name was a sigh, a prayer, a key turning in a lock I never knew existed. "Tell Elara, the song, her song. The lark in the morning, it was always for her. I'm sorry. I was a coward. Tell her, her father, loved her. Always." The world did not so much slow down as it simply stopped. The air was sucked from the room. My own heart seemed to freeze in my chest, a hard, cold stone. A violent, dizzying wave of nausea washed over me. I stumbled back from the bed, my hand flying to my mouth to stifle a scream. Elara. Her song. The lark in the morning. It couldn't be. It was a coincidence. A cruel, impossible trick of a grieving, exhausted mind. There had to be other Elaras. Other songs. But I knew, with a certainty that felt like a physical blow to the chest, that there were not. My mother's secret song, the one she hummed when she was happy, when she was sad, when she was thinking of the father she couldn't remember, was the lark in the morning. She said it was the only thing she had left of him. A silly, simple, lilting tune he would hum while he whittled wood on the back porch or worked in his vegetable garden. A tune she had never heard anywhere else. A tune she had passed down to me as our own secret lullaby. A tune no one else in the world knew. I stared at Arthur Pembroke's face, and for the first time, I truly looked. I looked past the illness, the age, the patient. I searched for the ghost of the young man in the single, faded photograph my mother kept tucked in the back of her jewelry box. The high forehead. The gentle slope of the nose. The way his hair, even now, white and thin, had a slight, stubborn wave to it. The pieces of a puzzle I never knew I was solving clicked into place with a deafening, soul-shattering finality. The lonely man with no family. The profound regret. The name. The song. Arthur Pembroke was my grandfather. The man I had treated for 3 years. The man whose heart I had monitored, whose medications I had adjusted, whose quiet wisdom had comforted me, was my mother's father. The great, gaping absence in her life, the ghost that had haunted her and shaped her and, in turn, shaped me, had been lying in a hospital bed 10 miles from her home, and I, her own daughter, had been the one tending to him. He had known. All that time, he had known exactly who I was. Every conversation, every shared silence, every time I had placed my stethoscope on his chest, he had been listening to the heartbeat of his granddaughter. The sheer, staggering weight of his secret, carried alone all those years, felt like it would crush me. Why hadn't he said anything? The answer was in his own story, in his own words. The shame was a cage. To reveal himself to me would have been to admit his monstrous failure, and he couldn't bear to see the judgment in my eyes, to witness the dawning horror as I realized the kind of man my grandfather was. He chose to have me in his life as a kind, distant doctor rather than not have me at all. It was the tragic, flawed calculus of a deeply broken man. The following week was the longest and most disorienting of my life. I moved through my duties like a ghost, a specter haunting the halls of my own life. I diagnosed, I prescribed, I spoke in rounds, but my mind was 1,000 miles away, trapped in that moment, listening to those final words on an endless, haunting loop. I was a coward. The words were his confession, but they felt like an indictment of my own life. Hadn't I been a coward, too? Hiding behind my white coat, using my profession as a shield against my mother's emotions, against the messy, complicated work of repairing our relationship? I had judged Arthur for his one, catastrophic act of cowardice, but my own was a slow, steady cowardice enacted over a decade. I couldn't eat. I couldn't sleep. The fortress of my identity was in ruins. I was no longer Dr. Eris Thorne, the unflappable cardiologist. I was just a woman, standing in the wreckage of a secret that connected my professional and personal lives in a way I could never have imagined, a connection that was both beautiful and devastating. I knew I had to tell my mother. The truth was a ghost that now lived between us, and it demanded to be seen. I drove to her house on a Thursday afternoon. I hadn't called. I found her in her studio, not painting, but sorting through a pile of old sketches, memories scattered around her like fallen leaves. She was wearing one of my father's old flannel shirts, the one she always wore when she was feeling vulnerable or sad. He had died when I was in college, a loss we had never properly grieved together, another casualty of my emotional retreat. Eris, she said, her face etched with surprise and immediate concern. She stood up, wiping her dusty hands on her jeans. What's wrong? You're white as a sheet. Are you sick? I stood there, just inside the doorway, still in my scrubs and white coat. I hadn't even changed. The coat felt different now. It wasn't a symbol of my authority, it was the garment of the messenger, the bearer of a truth that would shatter her world. A patient of mine died last week, I began, my voice hollow, distant, as if it were coming from someone else. Oh, honey, she said, her tone softening. She took a step towards me, her arms half opening for an embrace. I'm so sorry. I know how hard that is for you. I took a small step back, unable to bear her touch. This had to be done with distance, or I would fall apart. His name was Arthur Pembroke. The name meant nothing. She just nodded, waiting for me to continue, her artist's eyes searching my face for the real story, for the source of this strange, frozen grief. He was a kind man. Lonely. We talked, sometimes. He became a friend. I took a shaky breath, the room tilting around me. Before he died, he spoke. It was just a breath, really. But he said a name. I paused, gathering every ounce of courage I possessed. My mother waited, her brow furrowed in confusion and growing apprehension. he said, Ilara. The reaction was instantaneous and visceral. She flinched as if I'd struck her. The color drained from her face. Her hands, which had been holding a charcoal sketch of a bird in flight, fell to her sides. The paper fluttered to the floor, the bird landing on the concrete, forgotten. What? The word was a whisper, a plea for me to stop, to take it back. He said, "Tell Ilara the song, her song. The lark in the morning, it was always for her." My voice broke. I was crying now, the tears streaming down my face freely. He said, "Tell her, her father, loved her. Always." The silence that followed was absolute. It was the silence after an explosion, when the sound has been so loud it leaves only a vacuum in its wake. My mother didn't move. She didn't breathe. She just stared at me, her eyes wide with a storm of disbelief, confusion, and a dawning, horrifying comprehension. Her face, usually so expressive, was a mask of shock. Then, slowly, the mask began to crack. A small, wounded sound, like that of a trapped animal, escaped her lips. Her legs gave way, and she sank onto a nearby stool, her body folding in on itself as if all the bones had been removed. "No," she whispered, shaking her head, over and over. "No, no, no. That's not possible. It can't be. It's a mistake." "It was him, Mom," I said, my voice thick with tears. I walked toward her, kneeling on the paint-spattered floor before her. I took her cold, trembling hands in mine. They were ice-cold. Arthur Pembroke. He was here. In the city. He was my patient for 3 years. He was kind and gentle, and he carried so much regret. He thought of you every single day of his life. He loved you. He always loved you. The dam broke. A sob racked her body, then another. It was a grief I had never seen in her, a raw, primal wound being torn open after 50 years. It wasn't just grief for the father who had died, it was grief for the father she had never had, for the childhood that had been stolen, for the lifetime of anger and loss that had now been rendered so complicated and ambiguous. She wept for the little girl who had waited by the window, for the teenager who had lied about her father being dead, for the woman who had built her entire identity on being abandoned. "Why?" she cried, her voice a ragged tear in the quiet of the studio. "Why didn't he come? Why didn't he find me? Why didn't he tell you?" "He was ashamed," I said, squeezing her hands, trying to pour my own warmth into them. "He told me he'd made a mistake that fractured his life. He was a coward," he said. "He thought you were better off without him. He thought he didn't deserve your forgiveness. He was too afraid of your hatred." I watched as a lifetime of narrative was rewritten before my eyes. The story of the feckless father who didn't care was gone, replaced by the far more painful, human story of a flawed, terrified man paralyzed by his own shame. The anger that had been the bedrock of her identity for so long now had nowhere to go. It warred with a grief so fresh and profound it seemed to age her in minutes. She was a ship that had lost its anchor, adrift in a sea of conflicting emotions. The days and weeks that followed were some of the most difficult and transformative of our lives. The revelation did not bring instant, movie-perfect healing. It brought chaos. There were days of white-hot rage from my mother. She screamed at the memory of Arthur for his cowardice. She threw a paint can across the studio, splattering a crimson streak like a wound across the wall. She raged at me, for being the one to bring this truth, for having known him when she couldn't, for the cruel, cosmic irony of it all. "He got to know you," she'd shout, her face contorted with pain. "He got to see the amazing woman you became. And I was here, alone, thinking he didn't give a damn about either of us." There were days of a bottomless, bewildering sadness where she would simply sit in the garden and stare into space, mourning the father she had only just begun to know through the lens of his death. She would dig out the few, faded photographs she had, looking at them with new, heartbroken eyes, searching his face for the love and the fear he had carried. But for the first time, we were in it together. The wall between us was gone, demolished by the seismic force of Arthur's secret. We stopped our ritual Sunday dinners and instead spent long, unplanned evenings together. We talked for hours. We cried. We yelled. We sat in silence. I told her everything about Arthur's love for poetry, his quiet dignity, the deep, abiding sadness in his eyes that I now understood completely. I told her about the day he confessed his story to me, and how I had seen my own reflection in his regret. I confessed my own cowardice, my own hiding behind my profession, my own fear of her tumultuous, emotional world. For the first time, she listened. She truly heard me. She saw the weight I carried, not as a badge of coldness, but as the heavy armor of a soldier on a brutal front line. And I, in turn, saw her not as a dramatic, difficult artist, but as a woman whose immense capacity for feeling was her greatest strength, a strength she had tried to give to me, and which I had rejected out of fear. I began to see her art not as chaos, but as courage, the courage to feel deeply and to express it fearlessly. We began the painful, beautiful process of getting to know each other again, not as mother and daughter trapped in their roles, but as two women, both shaped by the absence of the same man, both learning to forgive him and in doing so, learning to forgive each other and ourselves. A month after Arthur's death, we drove together to the cemetery. It was a bright, cold day, the sun a pale, brilliant coin in a hard blue sky. The headstone was simple and gray. Arthur Pembroke. Beloved father. I had chosen the inscription. It was the truth, however complicated. We stood there for a long time, side by side, not touching, but connected by an invisible thread of shared history and newfound understanding. The wind whipped our hair and stung our faces. My mother was clutching a small, folded piece of paper. After a long silence, she unfolded it. It was an old, faded drawing, done in a child's hand, a stick figure of a man and a little girl holding hands under a lopsided sun. I drew this the week after he left, she said, her voice quiet but steady, carried away on the wind. I was waiting for him to come back so I could give it to him. I thought if I made it beautiful enough, he would. She knelt, her knees pressing into the cold, dormant earth, and she placed the drawing against the headstone, weighing it down with a small, smooth stone she had picked up from her garden. She stayed there for a moment, her head bowed, her hand resting on the cold granite. Then, softly, so softly it was almost carried away by the wind, she began to hum. It was the tune. The Lark in the Morning. The same lilting, simple melody she had hummed to me as a child, the one she said was her only inheritance from her father. Tears streamed down my face, freezing on my cheeks. It was the most heartbreaking and beautiful sound I had ever heard. In that moment, she wasn't just mourning him. She was finally giving him the message he had so desperately wanted to send. She was telling him that she knew. She was telling him that she heard his song. She was offering a forgiveness he had never been able to ask for, a forgiveness that, in its granting, finally began to heal the fracture in her own soul. She was laying to rest not just a father, but a ghost. That was the real climax of my story. Not in a dramatic operating room, but in a quiet cemetery, watching my mother hum a childhood tune to the father who had finally come home. It was the moment the two halves of my life, the doctor and the daughter, the scientist and the artist, fused into one, complete, and whole person. Arthur Pembroke, in his dying breath, had given me the ultimate diagnosis. The broken heart that needed the most urgent care was my mother's, and by extension, my own. And he had given me the treatment, the raw, messy, courageous act of truth and connection. I am still a doctor. I still walk the halls of the hospital, the white coat a familiar weight on my shoulders. I still fight the good fight with every tool at my disposal. But I am no longer just a stone in the river, trying to resist the current. I have learned to flow with it, to feel its cold and its warmth, its turbulence and its peace. I allow myself to grieve with families now, to sit with them in their pain, because I understand that shared grief is the beginning of shared healing. I allow myself to feel the profound joy of a recovery, and I no longer hide the tears of relief. I have learned that the heart is not just a pump, it is a repository of stories, of songs, of secrets waiting to be heard. My mother and I still have our differences. She will never fully understand the pressure of my job, and I will never fully understand the compulsion that drives her to put brush to canvas. But that's okay. The wall is gone. We have found a new language, a duet between the steady rhythm of the heart and the wild, beautiful song of the soul. We talk every day, even if it's just for a minute. We have lunch in her chaotic, beautiful garden. I even let her teach me how to paint again. The first thing I painted was a lark, rising into a morning sky. Arthur's legacy is not one of abandonment. It is a legacy of connection. His final words were a key that unlocked two hearts, bridging a chasm of 50 years. He connected me to my past, to my mother, and in the most profound way, to myself. He taught me that the most critical surgery we can ever perform is not on the body, but on the silent, secret wounds that keep us from the people we are meant to love. The scars remain, of course. They always do. But they are no longer fossils of pain, they are the maps that show us where we have been, and remind us of the breathtaking fragility and resilience of the human heart. And sometimes, the bravest thing you can do is not to be an unmovable stone, but to be the river itself, to flow, to feel, and finally, to heal.